Welcome to another episode of Farming in Ohio with Chris Bruynis. Sole proprietor, LLC, something else? Well, Chris is going to be looking at the different business entities that a farmer can use. So stay tuned. Welcome back to another episode of Farming in Ohio with Chris Bruynis. Chris Bruynis is an extension educator with the Ag and Natural Resources program in Ross County. Today he's going to be looking at some things that I think a lot of individuals need a better understanding if they are getting into the farming or if they have a farm. And today Chris is going to be talking about the different business entities. Chris, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to be here.
I know that you've been in the farming business for many, many years, and I know that you have talked with many individuals, either being involved or starting their business. And I know that some individuals come up with the question, what kind of entity should I be?
Absolutely. And not only have I been hanging around agriculture and farming for my entire life, my parents operated as a sole proprietor. When I got out of college and came back to the family farm, we had a partnership agreement for the farm. And then after my parents have passed, my brother and sister and I are now operating in a limited liability company. So I have some firsthand experience with some of these entity structures that we can adopt. And whether it's for the farm or any business, as far as that goes, having an understanding of the different structures or different entities we can form, I think is important because there's a lot of misinformation and false securities giving in some of these structures that people think just because I have a limited liability company, I have no liability, which is absolutely not true. And so let's just talk about them a little bit.
Well, I think what you're saying is very, very true. And the reason I'm saying that is we many times will meet with our fellow farmers, and one individual may be a sole proprietor and another an LLC, and they give a few reasons why it's best for them. And so it's natural that we start becoming very confused what is best for us.
And so let's talk about that a little bit. When I get a question, I frequently get a question. When somebody calls me up and says, I'm starting a farm or I'm starting a business, and what should I be in terms of what kind of entity? There's 10 questions that come to mind that I think we need to start talking through in terms of deciding which entity is best. And so the first question is, who is going to manage this company? And typically when I get that phone call, it's the individual I'm talking to. And so to me, it's, do we need a complicated business entity if there's one person and that person is going to be managing the company? Are we going to have others involved, and are they going to be equal or limited partners? And so equal partners is one answer. Limited partners is a different answer. Are there going to be any investors other than the operators? And so if we're going to be attracting capital to this business, then how do we treat our investors and protect them? So that's yet a different answer. And then are we wanting to protect assets or from potential personal or business liability? And so again, crossing both ways. Do we want to avoid double taxation? Our corporations get taxed as a business, And then any distributions get taxed again, where we can avoid that with a different business entity. And so if that's really important to an individual, now there are advantages to having the corporation taxed if we're not doing distributions. And so we'll get into that, not too deep, but just a little bit as we go further. And then continuing on, is the expected business life short or long term? I know a lot of people that are starting a business, and it may be their retirement dream to live on the farm and grow produce and sell at the farmer's market, but their kids are off doing something different. This isn't a multi-generational business, and that's a different answer. And so, we start thinking about what's the time horizon for this business. Do we want it to be legally recognized as it's a distinct entity? Sometimes we don't want to use our social security number as our tax ID number in a sole proprietorship. And even if you're in a sole proprietorship, you can get a tax ID number and not use your social security, but you can clearly use your social security number. Do you want to start an enterprise where you are always the one of the chief operators? Or do you want to retire and somebody else manage that at some point in the future? And do you want the company to have a board of directors? And again, board of directors, they can be formal or informal. They could be paid, they could be unpaid. But again, that may determine which direction we go in terms of choosing the best entity. And then do you want to be in control of the company? And I mean, the answer is usually yes. And that's even with families that have complicated business entities. It's hard to let go of the control or harder to let go of the reins. Some entities provide mechanisms that are easier than others. So that's kind of the list of questions I go through.
Does the size of the farm, is that also important?
Not in choosing the entity in terms of size or dollar volume of sales. I think when it starts to think about, I think it's the number of people involved, and maybe if we have multiple enterprises, and let's say we have a trucking company, we have an agricultural production farming company, if you will, and maybe we have a leasing company. And so, if we got multiple companies, that's probably best not to be done as a sole proprietor. And so, again, I don't think it's the size necessarily more than the complexity of the number of businesses that are occurring under the umbrella of the farm. So let's talk about sole proprietor. Its main advantages, and again, I scoured the website to find ideas that I didn't think of, and so I've borrowed some ideas from other websites across the internet. And these are the main advantages, and I agree with these. They're easy to create and maintain. I can create a piece of paper that says I'm in business, put it on my door, and I'm in business. I'm created. And so I don't need any articles from the state or any kind of tax ID number. I can use my social security number. And so it's really easy to create. And so if I want to be a farmer tomorrow and open a produce stand, there's nothing that stops me from doing that as a sole proprietor. The business owner and the business are legally the same entity. And so that doesn't mean I can't say I'm Chris Bruynis doing business as XYZ Farms, but I'm the same entity. There's no fees associated with the creation of the business. And then the business losses and the business gains flow through to my personal tax return. And so that's kind of the real easy first step. And again, I think most businesses start as sole proprietors and then mature into a different business structure as we have more complexities that happen within the business.
The state of Ohio does ask that individuals register with them. That way they are able to make sure they are following the guidelines, especially when it comes to hiring individuals. There is a fee to that, though.
There is a fee, and again, I would highly recommend getting a taxpayer ID number as well, which there is not a fee to that, just because to protect your Social Security number. And so, as we think about sole proprietors' disadvantages, again, the owner is on the hook for everything, whether there's any personal liability for debts, judgments, or any other liabilities of the business. They also flow through to the owner of that business. And so, we talked earlier before we started recording, Patrick, that, liability insurance, a good liability insurance product is a must. And I don't think it matters which business entity we choose. We still need to have a good liability protection. And I'll talk more about that under the LLCs, that it really doesn't protect us like most people imagine it does. And then the other thing is the income taxes for all net profits flow through to the owner. And I don't know if I think that of that as a disadvantage. You don't have as many ways to shelter that income, if you will, or to hide it. Might be a better word. If you're a sole proprietor, it's going to flow through. But I always heard that not making money is a worse problem than making money. And so if we're making money and there's some taxes due, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's move on to general partnerships. They're also easy to create. You will get an attorney involved in the creation of a general partnership. I operated this as I came into the family business, farming business in 1982. We entered a general partnership. There were multiple owners. We documented what percent of share each owner had, and then the income or losses were divided on that percentage share basis. There was no government fees associated with the creation of the business entity, but again, there were some attorney fees. And then I wouldn't say there was no government fees. You will have to file an information return for the partnership, and then that income and loss flows through to your personal tax return. And so the income and losses go back to the personal tax return. And so we start thinking about the disadvantages of a general partnership. Again, there's no liability protection for the owners. They're all jointly and personally liable for any debts, judgments, or liabilities of the business. And this is one of the things that I think an LLC has a little bit of an advantage, because with a general partnership, all owners are liable, even if they were not the ones that created the liability. It still flows through to the owners. And so I think that is a major disadvantage, or a main disadvantage, of a general partnership. And the owners must pay the personal income taxes for net business profits. But I don't know how you're going to get out of, unless you go to a corporation, of paying taxes on business profits, unless you choose corporate tax structure for an LLC. But all the other structures flow through. And again, I'm not sure that's a disadvantage, but it's something you want to think about depending on the complexity of the business. I threw in a slide here on limited partnerships because we still hear about those. And really the only main difference from a general partnership to a limited partnership is we can add those limited partners, and those limited partners may be grandma or grandpa with some investment money to help the business get started. And so they're only going to be liable, or on the hook, if you will, for the amount of their investment. And so there's no liability that's going to flow through to their personal assets. Their home is not at risk. Their investments, retirement accounts are not at risk. And so if they give you $10,000 to start a business and they want to be listed as a limited partner in that general partnership, that protects them then. And so they enjoy that limited liability for any debts, judgments of the business. And that's really the main difference of setting up a general partnership and a limited partnership.
I think when you mentioned having an attorney is so important. You know, sometimes we go on the internet and we can find these forms that we can create our own limited liability or general partnership. And I've always discouraged that because an attorney really knows the business law.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, filling out a form and getting the right answer in the right place really doesn't make us any more intelligent about are we making the right decision, where that attorney's time and knowledge is worth the cost that's associated with it, by all means. And so let's talk about corporations. I don't see as many corporations in farming anymore. We started a lot of these back in the 60s. That was before we had limited liability companies, and there were some advantages until they tried to pass that land out of the corporation, and then all of a sudden they found out there was huge tax disadvantages to corporations in terms of having the corporation own property. But the main advantage is we do have limited liability for the business debts. It does not come through the corporation to the owners in terms of any liabilities or judgments. Only what's in the corporation is at risk. Some benefits may be deducted as a business expense if we have a corporation and we want to provide, let's say, healthcare benefits to our owners and employees. That becomes a business expense of the corporation, and then it's a benefit that comes on to the owners. And then with good accounting, and again, it takes good accounting. We can't do this subpar. The owner in the business may be able to pay lower taxes by splitting the business profits among owners versus it passing through to just one or two owners.
Does that apply to both C corporations and subchapter S corporations?
It does, and I didn't split those out because when I was researching this, I didn't find enough differences, and I didn't want to go that deep into the weeds. Again, having a good attorney will help you understand the nuances between a C corporation and an S corporation. So main disadvantages, they are much more expensive to establish than any of the other business entity structures that we have available to us. The paperwork is complicated, must be filed with the Secretary of State annually, and then the corporation must pay its own taxes as a separate tax entity, and then including capital gains on the sale of assets, even in estate distribution situations, moving that land out of the corporation. And where we're seeing this really, I mean, we go back even in my parents' generation in the 60s, my parents paid $100 for some of the farmland that they purchased, and that today can be sold for $10,000. And so, you know, you're looking at $9,900 of income that would be subject to capital gains. And if I don't have it in a corporation and I just pass it through the estate process from one landowner to another, or even from an LLC to an individual, you would get that step up in basis, where the corporations don't enjoy that step up in basis. So, you know, before I go to a corporation, I really have to have good reason and understand what I'm doing. And the limited liability company, that is kind of our favorite one that I hear people talking about. Like I mentioned at the beginning, my brother and sister and I have just a land holding limited liability company at the moment that our parents' estates flowed into in terms of the land in those estates. And the main advantage is we do enjoy some limited liability, but not as a. And let me give an example. Here's a great example that I heard given. I am driving a piece of equipment down the highway, and there's an accident, and it's determined that I'm at fault. And the company gets sued Well, because I was operating the equipment, they can pass right through that company and come to my personal assets as well. Now, what they can't go to then is the other owner's personal assets. Now, if I had an employee that was driving that piece of equipment and he had made an error or she had made an error and the company was liable, then the only thing that's at risk is the company's assets, not personal assets. And so as we set these up and we get more complicated, you may want to think about, if I've got equipment on the road, I may want to have an equipment limited liability company that leases farmland from a landholding limited liability company. Now, if I own both of them and I'm the one that goofed up, all of it's at risk. But if I have an employee and they're operating equipment, they can't get to the land either because it's leased from another company. And so, it gets complicated, but we start thinking about how these things work. And I think the limited liability company does offer a lot of options that are not available in the other structures or entities. Business profits and losses are allocated to the owners based on the ownership percentage. With mine, each of us own a third, so that's pretty easy. But I do know some limited liability companies that the different owners have different ownership percentages. And so the business profits or losses would flow through on different percentages. And then we can choose how it'll be taxed. We can either be taxed as a partnership, which flows through to individual tax returns, or we can choose to be taxed as a corporation, which then the LLC would pay taxes on its earnings before distributions, and then distributions would be taxed again. So I've not quite figured out what the advantage of being taxed as a corporation is, but it is a choice we do have. And then what a lot of people are using limited liability companies for in terms of the landholding company, it eliminates partition sale issues at time of transition from one generation to the next. And let me give an example there. My brother and sister and I inherited a farm. If we did not put it in a limited liability company and one of us wanted to get our interest out of that land, we could force a partition sale at the courthouse steps for the farm to be sold so that I can get my third interest out. Now I own 1/3 of the shares of a limited liability company, and the rules of the limited liability company tells me how I can get out of the company, but the company actually owns the land, so it's not titled as ABC Bruynis heirs. It's titled as Hollandia Farms LLC, and so it does help with that. So it has some advantages. And then the last one I want to talk about, disadvantages. They are more expensive to establish than a sole proprietor. Maybe not a partnership. Some people think they are, depending on what state you're in. Here in Ohio, they're not very expensive to establish. But again, a good attorney, there will be some attorney fees. And then I don't want people to think just because the title says we've limited the liability, that it doesn't limit our personal liability. If we're the one operating the farm, I know farmers out there that are individual owners. They own the entire limited liability company, and they think their personal assets are protected, and that is not true.
It sounds like in addition to a really good attorney, you also better have a very good accountant that understands the legal entities.
Absolutely. And so I know we're going to run out of time, but here in conclusion, I really want to say there's really no best entity. Hopefully I didn't come across saying, pick this one. I think they all have their advantages and their disadvantages. Starting as a sole proprietor, I think, is where a lot of people can still start. I think it's a good place to start, unless it's a very, very complicated business to begin with. More formal business entities can be adopted as we go down the road without really changing how we operate. dissolving more formal entities if we get to the point that we're only one generation and the next generation doesn't want this business. Dissolving that formal entity can require more expense, more legal assistance, more tax consequences. And so, I would really want to have a good reason for moving beyond a sole proprietor before I did that because of long-term consequences. And then we mentioned this earlier, Patrick, always consult legal counsel before entering any kind of business entity, even if it's a sole proprietorship.
I think that makes a lot of sense in the fact that, the attorneys and the accountants are the ones that save you or put you in jeopardy if you don't listen to them.
You said accountants, and I will throw into that not only accountants that may do payroll, accountants that may do your books for you, but tax accountants as well. And so I'm thinking accountants in a broad definition of all of those support roles that we have for hire out in the marketplace.
It's interesting. We really don't need to be established legal entity until something wrong happens. And then talk about remorse. Oh, I should have did this. I should have done that. And so understanding what those legal entities are, I think is very, very important, even just to discuss with an attorney.
Correct. And I mean, there's plenty of reading material out on the internet about the different entities. Everybody has an opinion, but it's like the saying, opinions are a dime a dozen. You'll have to form your own. Find somebody you trust. Find somebody you trust that's going to steer you correctly. And again, I wouldn't get too excited about a very complicated business structure unless the business requires that, or unless there's a lot of risk involved, and you want to make sure that if this goes south, I'm not homeless and living in my car because I've put too much at risk.
Understand. Hey, we're talking with Chris Bruynis. Chris Bruynis is an extension educator with the Ag and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. Through his email contact, if you have additional questions or if you would like to discuss more in detail some of these business entities. Chris, thank you.
Always a pleasure.